Okay, we're live. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, Brandon. We have Brandon McCoy, Senior System Engineer at Veeam, myself, Dave Kluger, CTO at Storcom. Thank you, Brandon, for joining us today.
My pleasure.
We got a good lineup here for what we're going to be discussing. I think we've decided to kind of go over what we came up with as best and worst practices. Kind of picked a few things from each category. I think we're going to start with the worst, but just to kind of kick things off a little bit, just a little background who Storcom is. I think most everybody who's on this webinar knows who Veeam is. We're obviously going to be going into that a lot more depth. Storcom, we're a managed services provider. We're a cloud solution provider with Veeam. We have 2 decades worth of experience now with doing disaster recovery and business continuity planning. That's where all of the engineers that work at Storcom, our background has come from that. We're a top Veeam solution provider, and we have a number of we have multiple data centers that we host Veeam as a cloud solution provider solution from doing disaster recovery and business continuity with. And we'll get into a lot more of kind of where we think our value proposition is. But that's just a brief background on who we are. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brandon. We can go ahead and start talking about data protection worst practices. And I think the first one here, I'll kind of kick off. This was one that I came up with. I want to talk a little about not documenting things when you are making changes to your backup environment. And this kind of applies to pretty much everything. I'd say documentation of any changes you make in environment, but we'll talk about specifically within your backup environment. Just kind of a real world example. We had a client recently who was having technical problems with their solution. Turned out that there was a problem with the solutions they were using with SMB3. Obviously, when new releases of products come out, the vendors try to test with as many scenarios as possible, but it's not always possible they can come up with every scenario. And with this version of software and this particular customer environment, their SMB3 was causing problems. There was problems with the backup environment and the performance that they were getting. And when we started to try to dig deeper into this, it took us a while to figure this out. And finally, we got around to looking at this and saying, well, we knew they'd done an upgrade, but nobody seemed to know when. And then once we finally got down to figuring out exactly when the change was made, we correlated it right down to that day and figured out that was when the performance problem occurred. And there was a patch and there was a way to fix the problem. But we wasted a lot of time. And the point is that proper documentation, and as much as maybe things like change request forms for upgrades and so forth maybe seem like more work than they're worth, definitely can help you solve problems a lot faster. And that's definitely one thing that I think that Storcom as an MSP, we try to impart on our customers, and we certainly practice that within our own environment. Having a QA environment to be able to test stuff is obviously useful, but just having proper documentation will really save a lot of time when it comes to things like troubleshooting. So that was one that I came up with. Brandon, you can go ahead and talk about the next one.
Yeah, sure. So the second one here is not having an air gap. So for those of you who aren't familiar with what air gap means, that just means it's not connected to the internet. There's no way that I can reach it from a network. So typical old school air gap solutions were tape. That's definitely a cheap way to have backups or data that is not connected to the internet. You can eject those tapes, put them in what we call a media vault so that they can't be accessed. Put them in an actual physical vault as well. Thing about tape is, there's still a lot of tapes in use these days, but when you have to go restore from a tape, it's not the prettiest thing. Also, verifying those backups, something that's very hard and cumbersome to do with tapes. Really just a matter of taking those tapes, putting them back into tape drives, doing the restore, seeing that it works, and then undoing those changes. So I've seen it in the past where somebody has these tape backups for years and years. They never test them. The tapes could be faulty at the physical layer or just inside with the software layer. So we have some different options for air gapping your backups, whether it's Cloud Connect Insider Protection, just different ways that we can keep those backups off of the internet. is definitely a good strategy for securing your backups.
Yeah, good point, Brandon. One thing I wanted to point out, so we're doing things a little bit differently this time from the standpoint of questions and answers. If anybody has questions, Heidi will kind of try to field these questions as we're going along. I thought it might be more useful to have people ask questions instead of doing a Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions that you want to, ask specifically to one of these, worst or best practices, please feel free to reach out. Heidi will field the questions and get them over to us. Is not properly sizing your storage needs to meet your retention policies. We, as a cloud solution provider, we see this all the time. It's very easy for anybody to try to, you think of your backup set, your front end data, and how much that might take up in space, and then assume that you've got, some amount of deduplication and compression that may occur. So you try to make an estimate on what you think the back end would need. And usually what we see is customers come back and say, well, I don't know, we got 10 terabytes of data, so we're gonna need 10 terabytes of backup storage. And that unfortunately does not really line up necessarily with what your retention policies are. Because 10 terabytes of front end data, meaning the data that you're backing up, how much storage is going to be needed on the back end is obviously going to be vastly different whether you have a 2-week retention policy versus a 7-year retention policy, because I've got incremental data that's changing, possibly some synthetic fulls occurring during that process. So really sizing this out ahead of time is going to save you and your organization a lot of headaches and potentially cost, because there's kind of two parts to this. You have a potentially a local appliance, which if that's not sized properly, your first problem is going to be, well, I've run out of space. So now you have a physical limitation. And then secondly, you're going to have storage costs on your cloud solution provider side, which may balloon past what you initially, expected them to be. You may have thought you're going to be paying for 10 terabytes, but based upon your retention policy, that's not necessarily going to line up with what those retention policy needs are. So that's where, properly sizing this is a good exercise to do beforehand, so you can properly budget and size accordingly.
Hey, Dave, we have a question. What is the best way to size my environment?
Okay. So it's a good question. So as a Veeam solution provider, Storcom has access to a number of tools that Veeam has. We can model this out to a fairly good level of accuracy. We understand the data types as well as the retention policies for those data types, and then basically build out a model and say, okay, you've got 10 terabytes of data. 5 terabytes of that is a file server, 3 terabytes are databases, the rest are miscellaneous files of whatever type, operating systems. And of that data, the 5 terabytes of file serving data is going to be kept for 5 years, and everything else we're fine with keeping just for 90 days, let's just say. We can size that out and then tell you exactly how much storage it's going to require to be able to do that. I mean, obviously there's some things that may come into play that may, change those numbers, but we can, with the tools that Veeam has provided to us, and our own knowledge of kind of overall sizing and deduplication numbers, we can get fairly accurate estimates on what you'll need for local and remote retention. Hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, okay. And David, just to add to that, when we're talking about understanding sizing storage needs to meet retention policies, I think a lot of times what's also important is to understand those retention policies and why you need them. There's some backup softwares that work differently than others, so they may, tout that they offer something like 15-minute backups, and we can keep them for as many years as you want. And Veeam can do all of these things as well. But when we look at how we structure our backup data, it's important to kind of see the what that's going to look like. For instance, I had a service provider who had a customer who was insistent upon backing up every day and keeping those daily backups for 7 years. So they're in essence saying they want to be able to go back to any day of the year for 7 years. And then when we start asking, how are you going to know when a file changed on what specific day 6 years ago? And if that is something you need, we're going to have to build a lot of additional things. It's not just, some forever chain that goes on for 7 years, we have to start kind of, shoring those backups up and kind of consolidating. So understanding things like grandfather, father, son, your weeklies, monthlies, and yearlies. Typically what we see is more frequent backups in the for the more recent backups, and then as those backups age out, we kind of condense them into maybe a weekly or a monthly. So that can help a lot too, just in terms of how much storage space you're actually going to require for those retention policies.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. I mean, understanding those GFS rotations certainly are a big part of that. I think that this what you just pointed out also kind of these 2, 3, and 4 kind of go together. Not properly sizing resources in general, right? Understanding we're not just talking about storage, but what about compute and memory and so forth, and all the other pieces that come into play when you're looking at a backup environment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess that's a good segue into this fourth piece. So yeah, not properly sizing your resources. So that those do kind of go hand in hand, but what's the difference in them, right? So not properly sizing your resources. Now we're talking about all the other Veeam components. The first thing that everybody thinks of with backup is how much storage do I need to hold these backups? And that's definitely a very important part. But another important part is your expectations of Veeam. Veeam is a great product. I love it. And it works fantastic, but we're just software. We're not bound by any specific vendor. There's not one specific, that works, better than others in terms of what you run the Veeam software on. So what we really rely on is how many CPU, how much memory does this backup server have in order to process X number of machines or X amount of data within a certain backup window, right? And so understanding those resources are very important. Things like the proxy role. How many CPU and RAM does my proxy need to move a certain amount of data? How many CPU and memory does the repository have to be able to ingest that data, and things like that are very important as well.
Yeah, no, those are all good points. The next
another question. I think this one is for
Brandon.
You mentioned not properly sizing. Do you have any documentations or tools to help with that?
Great question. So as a matter of fact, we do. And you know what? I'll show you real quick. I think we have enough time. So let me just really quick. So this is our Veeam simulation or Veeam sizing tool. It used to be called the Restore Point Simulator. This is a newer one. It's a lot more clean, a lot better, and it works for different things. So I'll walk you through just real quick. They should have some pre-made examples here. So we start with the workloads. So they're going to ask you a little bit about what you're protecting. So you can give it, whatever name you want. Are these virtual machines or agents? That does come into consideration when we talk about deduplication and things like that. If we're doing a virtual machine backup, we'll say over a 10-year growth for for a 3-year scope with 10% growth every year. The source amount of data, how long you expect that full backup to take, how many virtual machines you're backing up, whether you're using per VM, and these are kind of a little more intricate. You can always reach out to us, and we'll give you what each one of these means. But if you're familiar with most of these terms, you should be able to kind of, run through this and your daily backups and the GFS that we mentioned, maybe 4 weeklies, 7 monthlies, 12 yearlies, whether or not you want to use object storage. Do you want to move your backups to object storage or copy them to object storage? And then we'll add that workload. Get that out of the way here. Okay. And once we do that, we're able to get oops. Sorry, 1 second here. Okay. There we go. So we'll calculate, and this will give you a breakdown of everything. So the 3 main components of Veeam are the backup server, the proxy, which is the data mover, and the repository. And it'll tell you how much cores and RAM each one of those pieces need, whether you need maybe multiple proxies for different sites or heavier workloads, and and also the amount of storage space that you're going to be using. And if you're going to use things like object storage, it'll also help calculate that. You can even put in the cost of that object storage provider. So this tool can definitely help you with that. I'm going to drop this in the chat. This is our Veeam best practice guide. That tool is within there, but that's going to give you all kinds of information on best practices, security, and sizing all your resources as well.
Great, good info. Thanks, Brandon. So the next one was not validating your backups. I think you touched upon this a little bit about, this goes back to some of the quote unquote benefits of tape being air gap, but then one of the big ones on the flip side of that was the old concept of, I'm going to date myself here, but when I started in the industry, we were doing what was called hanging tapes. Reel-to-reel tapes are running off of mainframes. And there were notoriously problems with these tapes. You go grab data to restore them, the data didn't come back, and you were in big trouble at that point. One of the advantages of disk to disk is that you have the capability to do things like easily checking and validating backups. Veeam has a number of great technologies built into the platform. They do take a little, some additional services to get set up and so forth. But there are ways to validate backups and make sure that the backup that you took from the night before is at least a fully functioning backup, that there aren't errors, that there aren't reasons why it's not going to restore. And unlike tape, because the problem with tape was you were dealing with a magnetic medium. It was made on obviously plastic, which there was a lot of potential environmental things that would cause tapes not to function properly. Well, with disk to disk, you really don't have that problem. So by validating backups, we can ensure that the data will be able to be recovered when you need to recover it. So I think that's probably one of the things I say by not doing that or not leveraging those features within the Veeam platform, you're really kind of leaving a piece out of the backup process, because we don't back data up for the reason of backing it up. We back data up so we can restore it. And hopefully when we need to restore it, obviously, as I said, it's not tape, so we don't have to worry about that problem. But I do want to make sure that the backup actually functions. So leveraging Veeam's, short backups and so forth, and the number of different recovery capabilities and ability to check these backups is a great way to validate that the process is working properly and tested. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, Brandon, but that kind of I still think is an important thing to be doing. So if you're not doing it, that's kind of, I'll put it into the worst practice.
Yeah, no doubt. The Sure Backup is great. I love Sure Backup for verifying those backups. And, just to kind of expand on it a little bit, there's a lot of backup softwares out there, and a few of them, I won't mention any names, but they offer you a screenshot proof of life. So they do kind of what we're doing under the hood in terms of, turning this machine on without it interfering with production. So the actual production machine is still running and it's not interfering with that, but there's like a copy of this machine turned on. They screenshot the login screen and they go, there, see, if you wanted to log into that machine, you could. Well, that's great. But what if I, need the SQL server on there and, SQL's not working, or that's my domain controller and that application failed. So Veeam actually goes into the application. We ping the machine. We do a VMware Tools heartbeat test, or we'll do Hyper-V integration services. And then we'll also check the application inside for most of your main applications, some of the ones I just mentioned. So it's a lot more than just a screenshot of the login.
No, that's a great point. We just did a DR test for a client of ours where the machine that we brought online, they were not doing Sure Backup. The machine had not been tested. And to your point, if they were using a technology that was just basically doing a screenshot of the login screen, the machine came up. But then when we logged in, 3 of the 5 drives were missing from the operating system, so the database wouldn't come up. It turned out that it's a corrupt file system. So
Ouch. Being
able to check at the operating system level, being able to just see a login screen doesn't really necessarily mean the application's functioning properly. So that's a great point.
Yeah, and
Um,
I guess I'll grab this last one here. So, not securing your environment. We had talked about this number 6, what it was going to be for worst practices, and I think we had a more general cutting corners, but that was a little too vague, and all of these really could be cutting corners. But
right.
securing your environment, I think, is where cutting corners. I do see that are not securing your environment is definitely a corner cutting strategy. Unfortunately, that some people employ. One of the biggest ones, and I've seen this multiple times from ransomware attacks. I'm not there in the field when I see these ransomware attacks. We're backups company, so where if you get hit by ransomware, hopefully you have some secure backups you can restore from. But when I do talk to these service providers or customers, and they tell me, hey, this person was hit with ransomware, so now we're looking at Veeam, or we were using Veeam and we didn't set it up right. Okay, well, the first question I asked is, was your Veeam server on your production domain? 9 times out of 10, yes. Okay, was the Veeam server was the user for that Veeam server the domain admin? Yes, it was. So in both of those cases, whether you come in from the Veeam server or you come in from the production environment, that Veeam server is tied to it. These ransomware folks today, they know about backups. So they're not just going to lock up your environment. Then they're going to go search for that server that says, this is my Veeam server for backups, and they're going to lock that up, or they're going to delete all your backups. So, having your backups or your backup server on a separate domain or on a work group, which is a local service account, minimum permissions, that's probably one of the biggest pieces. There's some other security considerations, but that's the number one offender.
No, that's a great point. I mean, that's where we see, and again, that's unfortunately comes down to usually people are busy, people are trying to get stuff stood up and running properly, and yeah, it's a lot easier to take that machine and throw it on your domain and put it into the domain admin group. Use users in the domain admin group because we know that'll get the permissions properly. It's a lot more. It potentially can be more work to set it up the way you're saying, but that's the most secure way to do it. And sometimes doing it that way is, the correct way to do it, and doing it the wrong way is, in essence, like you said, cutting corners. And that can be, that can potentially turn back around and really create problems later on for you, especially with things like ransomware.
Yep.
Yep. Okay, so I think we're on to the best practices now. Are there any other questions, Heidi? I don't know, before we go on to best practices.
One question is, how can Veeam help with ransomware?
Yeah, I can grab that one, David. If that's, and then maybe
we'll go into that one on the next slide too a little bit. But go ahead and you.
Okay, yeah, I'll try not to ruin our thunder here.
Come on, we're part of our best practices.
Right. So we are going to see in the next slide some best practices that'll help you from that. And so we'll talk about that. Just a kind of quick statement. So I always like to say Veeam is not like I said earlier, Veeam is not a company that prevents ransomware from happening, although we do have some monitoring tools that can help you kind of be proactive. And we have some best practices that we were kind of talking about, securing your environment, making it secure. But Veeam is really there for if or when you get hit with ransomware, you've got all this set up, you've got these extra backups, and you've got these, best practices we're about to go over, so that when you get hit by ransomware, it's going to be okay because you do have some unaffected backups and you can restore from those. And we'll dive a little deeper into some specifics in this next slide.
Yep. Yeah, we'll hit that topic in a lot more detail, Heidi. And I think if there's any more questions, around that, we'll certainly circle back around. You want to go to the next slide? There we go. Okay. Brandon, I think maybe you want to take this first one.
Absolutely. So, there's a few different buzzwords. I guess shouldn't even call them buzzwords, but these words that get thrown around a lot, and features of Veeam. The 3-2-1 rule is one of my absolute favorite. So when I first started at Veeam, that was the first time I ever heard of this rule, and I thought that Veeam created it because I didn't have an IT background before I started here. Apparently, we did not, like Chick-fil-A, we didn't create the 3-2-1 rule, but yeah. Exactly. We made the 3-2-1 sandwich. So, but the 3-2-1, we're big proponents of it. So basically that means having 3 copies of your data, on 2 different medias, and one of those being offsite. Now, some people take this and go crazy and say 3, 2, 1, 1, 0, like one offline, one offsite, one. I like to keep it simple. The first copy of your data is your production data, so your virtual machines or your physical machines. Then the second copy is the first backup. So you have a backup, and that's on some sort of media. With Veeam, it's always going to be a disk first. From there, maybe it's object storage, maybe it's another, a Cloud Connect repository. But those are your 2 backups. One of those are offsite. So again, that's the object storage or the Cloud Connect. That way, not only are you protected from someone, hitting your local repository or deleting your local backups, or the local repository fails, the whole site, maybe goes down from a power outage or a tornado or something. So you've got an offsite copy as well. So you're getting protection from not only, the malicious actors or the ransomwares, but also the physical failures, having that offsite copy.
Yep. I mean, this goes back to, the old days of, again, tape with Iron Mountain, right? You always took your tape offsite. That's that offsite copy. I mean, it's still critically important to have that, and make sure that, I think we kind of talked a little bit about it in that previous slide, then that offsite copy, how can you get that data offsite and make sure it's disconnected from the copy that you have on premise? And that's where things like air gap come in. And that's how, also back to this question earlier, these are all the things that you have to start to do when you want to start to protect yourself against ransomware. As Brandon said, Veeam's not a ransomware protection company. That's not their job. If you got ransomware, there's other things we should be talking about outside of this. But Veeam's job is to basically give you that belt and suspenders. It's the final place that you go when you need to restore data, and when you do need to restore data, you want to make sure that you can get that data back properly and that the data is intact. And that's really what the 3-2-1 is really about. I think the next one, I was going to talk a little bit about. I see this, more with a lot of our clients. This is kind of a constant theme, aligning business requirements with the right technology. And what I'm referring to is, in one of the last webinars we did, we talked about all the new features that Veeam has, right? We talk about things like backups, replication, and CDP. Well, what do those really mean? Well, we're really talking about recovery point objective, right? How much data am I willing to lose, and recovery time objective. I'm going to use a different piece of technology or a different type of technology within the Veeam platform, right? A backup, but typically we run once a day, let's just say. And then from there, the recovery capabilities are going to be either restoring the data or using an instant on capability where I turn the machine on within the repository. My recovery point objective on that is going to be different than replication or CDP. So where I'm going with this is that before you start to deploy a new solution, or you want to start to think about doing a more robust business continuity plan, talk with the business, understand what are those requirements. We get this question, I can't tell you how many times I've heard this. So what do you guys recommend? Well, I can tell you what we recommend, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing for your business. You need to know what, from a legal standpoint, talk to legal. Are there compliance requirements in the business that say you need to make sure that you have, no data loss no more than X number of minutes, hours, days, or the recovery time, we need to have the systems back up, these particular systems back up. And then when we have that, typically what we do is build what we call an application priority matrix, and we fill that in. We take the applications, and let's just say maybe it's the ERP system, the number one most important thing for your business. We align those systems with that technology. Maybe that goes on CDP, but your file server doesn't necessarily need to have CDP. It might just be that that's fine with the backup, a normal nightly backup, and the recovery time of 24 hours is more than adequate for a file server. I don't know, that's just an example, but aligning business requirements with the right technology is really important when it comes to how you roll out the solution, the success of the solution, and the success of a disaster recovery plan built around that. And ultimately, a lot of this also comes down to how, from a cost saving standpoint, one technology may cost you more money from a consumption standpoint than another. So over planning or over provisioning something is not necessarily, you're using the best technology doesn't necessarily line up necessarily from a cost standpoint with your organization's needs. So that was one of the best practices I came up with. I think, Brandon, you're going to take the next one.
Yep. So making your backups immutable. So hint, hint to the person who asked about Veeam and ransomware protection. This is definitely one of those things. So this does protect you, at least your backups, from ransomware, right? So again, not the production environment, but that's why you do a backup in the first place. And so then having that backup safe and secure. So if you notice from the last slide, we talked about one of the worst practices is not having an air gap. And one of the best practices is having immutable backups. And this is not a play on word. Immutable and air gap are sometimes conflated, but they are two different things. Sometimes they can give you the same result in that your data is safe, but it works in a different way. So for instance, if I have an air-gapped backup, that means it's offline. It cannot be hit. I use Cloud Connect as an example, even though it's Cloud Connect backup is still online. But from the customer side of the house, with this insider protection feature, the customer is going to have a local backup and then a copy of their backup in a repository offsite at the service provider side. If the customer logs into their Veeam server and deletes backups, or if a ransomware virus writes to that backup, either we'll force a move from the delete or we'll preemptively have a copy of that backup for the encryption outside of the customer's reach, because there's an abstraction there and the customer has no idea what's on the other side. All they're connected to is a folder. From their side, there's no way they can get past that folder. So it is air gapped in the sense of the customer can't reach that backup on their network, even across the internet. They would have to somehow hack into the service provider's network. So that would be a two-pronged approach. So that's an example of a semi air gapped. The other one would be like the tapes or removable hard drives. And we talked about some of the issues with those. Immutable backups are still online. So I can see them. But they're giving you the same kind of functionality in terms of you can't touch them. So even though they're there and they are connected to the internet, you can't do much with them. Now, I can restore from them. I can read them. So they're read-only backups, right? And so this works with, both on-premise Linux-based repositories. And we'll talk about that in another moment when we talk about the file system. I'll dive deeper into it. But Linux does have the ability to set immutability flags on local repositories. And then with the offsite, using an object storage as a repository, you can also make these backups immutable. So you can't delete them before the immutability period is over. You can't write to those backups to encrypt them, but you can read them and you can easily restore from them. So that's kind of a big difference between air-gapped and immutable. Anything else on that, David, that you'd like to add?
No, I mean, I think that, again, obviously number 5, we're going to go into that a little bit more. I think what I was about to talk to next plays into this, because there's the theme here. Obviously, we get this, with a lot of the webinars we have been doing, and we get this a lot as far as questions, is around ransomware. And again, this is part of your arsenal: that immutable backup, air gap, proper monitoring. These are all things that are necessary to really thwart the kind of malicious activity that's out there today. But it's again, I'm going to talk a little bit about monitoring here, but in monitoring in general, Veeam One is a superb tool that provides a lot of insight into your environment. It'll give you good information about things like orphan snapshots and sizing and all sorts of kind of system information around your VMware environment as it pertains to the backup, but also can do quite a bit more in giving you visibility into your environment. And one of the things that Veeam talks about, which this is not specific to Veeam One, but I'll give them credit for at least calling us out, which is putting thresholds in place and alerts in place to look for potential malicious activity, like CPU spiked at 90% for a period of time, along with high I/O. Well, may mean that you've got ransomware basically encrypting data in your environment. Now, obviously, at that point, that to Brandon's point earlier, Veeam is not a ransomware protection solution. You have to make part of your arsenal a solution like Veeam to have all these different pieces in place to have the immutable backup, the air gap, proper monitoring. But again, you can't forget the most important part, which is you got to stop it at the endpoint. So solutions outside of Veeam, stopping it at the endpoint are going to be the best way to protect yourself. So when we get asked that question, we say, okay, where do we start? We start at the endpoint. Your laptop, your desktop, that then transfers down to systems like servers and so forth. Within the network, what's going on. So solutions that we work with outside of Veeam, there's a number of technologies like Carbon Back, CrowdStrike, Arctic Wolf. These are all things that are trying to protect the endpoint. They're your best defense. If things get down to the point where you are having triggers go off inside your environment because CPU and IO utilization is high on a server, it means the ransomware is already in there. It's already doing what it's supposed to be, what they're trying to do. And if I have to now go to backups, and yes, they're immutable. So this malicious activity that was going out and trying to delete all my data within my backups can't be deleted. That's great. Good job, Veeam. We're proud that you're able to do that. But again, you're already the problem's already gotten too bad at that point. You have to look at the whole thing. Now, that doesn't mean, well, if you get a really good endpoint protection solution, you should just ignore these other things, because that wouldn't make sense either. I mean, I can have the best endpoint protection solution when I'm not going to say who it is, but let's just say vendor XYZ says we can stop 99.9% of all ransomware attacks within your environment. Does that mean I should not worry about immutable backups? Absolutely not. Because first of all, there's no technology out there today that can get to that level. And even if they can, somebody will outsmart that eventually. So you have to have this multi-pronged approach of the endpoint protection, monitoring for malicious activity, and then having a secure backup environment so that when you get to that point and you have to restore data because you've been hit, you at least know that the data's there. So that's that's why I wanted to bring up kind of monitoring as a best practice. And I think next one you're going to go into choosing the right file system, which ties right back into kind of all this, which is again a benefit that Veeam has.
Well, before you guys move on, there was a question asking whether or not Storcom can put immutable backups in our cloud.
Oh, yes, good question. So we are leveraging, which this kind of ties into what Brandon's about to talk to. We're leveraging the file system that's necessary now to be able to provide immutable backups for. So when you write data to a repository within our cloud, that data will not be deleted, as well as we also have the capability of writing to object storage, because there's two different types of ways to create an immutable backup. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to let kind of Brandon talk a little bit more and dive a little bit deeper into this. So Brandon, why don't you take that away and that kind of answer? This will go back to, but the short answer to that, Heidi, is yes. And the reason is because of number 5 that Brandon's about to talk about.
Yeah, awesome. And it's good to see, I only work with service providers. So I get to see a lot of different of the service provider solutions. It's good to see Storcom is on the front line of some of these newer features and testing those out and making sure that they're ready. So one of those is the Linux immutable repository. So how does that play into number 5, right? Well, there are a bunch of different ways that you can use the Linux immutability feature. So unfortunately, there's not an immutability feature for Windows. And this really isn't a Veeam limitation. It's just the OS, because a lot of the things that Veeam does, whether it's with object storage, we're just doing object lock. So if you use, one of the public cloud providers on the back end that we support for immutability, Veeam is not making the backups immutable, to be honest with you. We're making the API calls and doing everything we need, integrating with those public clouds to make it immutable. It's something they offer called object lock. And so with Linux, it's the same thing. Linux has these algorithms, these flags, so that you can put a lock on the files and they can't be deleted. Somebody asked in one of our last webinars, which I thought was great, what if I accidentally set my immutability to, 50 days? Well, you're going to, and I think it might have even been longer than that, but, whatever you put in there, that's what it's going to be. So that could be a bad thing if you didn't mean to do that. But I mean, it's kind of the whole reason that it is in the first place. So it gives you that protection. Now, when it comes to Linux immutability, there's two pieces. There's hardening the repository, which means instead of putting your root credentials to that Linux repository in the Veeam server and Veeam having those credentials stored in the database, we're going to allow you to do a one-time single sign-on with your credentials and not save them. So that way somebody can't get those credentials, go into the Linux box and say, undo everything I've done. So once we have that hardened repository, we then place these immutability flags, a simple click of a button, don't delete the backups for X number of days. Now, how that plays into choosing the right file system, well, there's two types of file systems that we recommend for your disk-based repository. And that's going to be Windows ReFS, or Linux XFS. And so the Linux XFS is one of my favorite repositories. And I'll be honest, I'm not a super big Linux guy. I don't know a lot about Linux, but just in terms of, if you do have the basic comfort level of just having a Linux, physical Linux server and formatting the drives as XFS for your file format, not only are you able to get the immutability with the Linux itself, but the XFS file system is similar to Windows ReFS in terms of we use internal dedupe. So what that means is any merge operations where the oldest backup is now expired and we need to move those changes into the next point, those merge operations are significantly increased. And also any kind of synthetic full backup. So we're talking your weeklies, monthlies, yearlies, any kind of long-term retention needs, rather than creating a full backup to be your weekly or yearly or monthly, we're just going to say, hey, I've already got the blocks that you're asking for. I'm just going to make note of that in my metadata. And instead of having to take up a bunch of extra storage space, we can take advantage of this ReFS or this XFS. And if you want to see how this works in more detail, if you just Google Veeam ReFS, 2 words, you'll see a very quick YouTube video that shows how those blocks are kind of handled and a quick blog on setting that up and kind of a description. XFS works the same. We don't have a video for it, but it's the same kind of capability. So if you're thinking about what should I put on site for my local repository, physical server is always my choice. And, with this Linux immutability, it's kind of hard to not want to go Linux, even though I'm not as familiar with the OS as I am with, your more popular Windows.
Yep. No. I would just kind of say this also. So we, not to knock Windows, but ReFS is good, but XFS is considerably better because of the way the fast cloning technology works and the metadata that you described. It is way more efficient from the standpoint of performance. We're seeing about a 50% performance increase and about a 30% data reduction increase in the way that the XFS file system is able to store data over traditional ReFS. So there are some good reasons to potentially use that, for your backup repository.
Awesome.
That's what we're using within our own infrastructure. To take advantage of that, but as you said, that could be part of your, there is a little bit more complication. There's a little bit more complication because we typically use a physical appliance also. For the local appliance, for the most part, we're still using ReFS because if we use Linux, it does create some more complications from the standpoint of we have to have a standalone backup and replication server, and then have a separate file system for the basically the Linux XFS. So it does make the implementation a little bit more complex. And for most environments, ReFS for that local repository seems to still work great. But on the back end, it gives us that capability of have faster backups and faster restores, and then also the immutability capability. The other thing too, I was going to point out too, when we talk about file systems, this is not a file system, but object storage is another way to create immutability. And we're going to be doing a webinar. I don't know when it is. ID will be sending out information on this, but we're going to be doing a webinar with Veeam as well as one of our partners that's in the object storage space that we're using to build out object storage within our own environment so that we can provide that also, because object storage is really the most immutable. in that it's not a file system. You can't delete the data itself. Although you can't delete an immutable, a backup repository, you can't delete the repository. In essence, you could go into the Linux operating system. Sorry, not the operating system. You could go into you could go in through VMware, or if it was a physical machine, through a disk manager and delete the entire LUN, which would in essence destroy the data. Now, ransomware couldn't do that, but somebody who was trying to do something malicious could. Whereas object storage, you can't do that at all, because it doesn't use the concept of LUNs or file systems. It's a completely different type of storage subsystem. So we're going to be doing a webinar on that. I think, Brandon, hopefully you're going to be joining us with that. So we're going to talk about object storage in general and why it's beneficial to the backup world, and a number of different things that are kind of coming down the pipe with that too. So I think our last point from a best practices standpoint, obviously Storcom being in the disaster recovery and business continuity space, I couldn't go without saying this, is testing your backup and your DRBC plan. We talked about things like Sure Backup earlier on. Sure Backup is a great way to ensure that your backups are working properly, but it's not a DRBC test. A DRBC test should be done. Everybody who's doing offsite, disaster recovery and business continuity should be at a minimum doing this at least once a year, which is flushing through your entire DR runbook, making sure all the connectivity that you expect to be working from a remote standpoint is working. Do I have to have, are the whitelists in place to make sure that when you fail over to Storcom, let's just say, is Microsoft still able to, send mail? Do you have external point-to-point VPNs that need to be put in place? Are they all working? There's a ton of stuff that goes into this, but not testing it is you've only gotten half the problem solved. There's no purpose in having a DRBC plan if you're not going to run through the test on a regular basis to make sure that everything's functioning properly. Because again, when we don't do these tests, this is when we find out 2 years later, because we haven't done a test because somebody said they just were too busy. Oh, it turned out that they have 3 new, point-to-point VPNs to outside providers that they didn't tell us about. And in the event that there was a disaster, they wouldn't be ready. These customers wouldn't be ready for those businesses to interact with their environment. So staying on top of this and forcing yourself to do that on a regular basis, although people should be communicating with us, it doesn't always necessarily happen. That's at least ensures that we're catching that stuff during that DR testing plan.
Yeah, that's a good point, David. I'll add to that. Veeam says it ourselves. We're a part of your DR strategy, but we're not the whole thing. Even when we use some of the more advanced stuff we have, like replication, right? We can have all of your machines replicated to another host, to a whole nother site, so that you could just power them on. And some people think, well, that's it. That's all I need. And as long as I test those to make sure that they turn on, what else do I need? Well, did you think about all your domain controllers? We're not updating DNS records for you. How are they going to reach these IP addresses? So Veeam is uplifting your data center or your hosts to another location with the same IPs. We're taking care of some of the very basic networking stuff. But to David's point, there's just so much more that goes into that that you really need to test for and make sure that you're going to be up in the time that you expect. And that there's no, oh, I didn't think about that, when it's too late.
Yep. I mean, that's the whole, we just funny story at the end of this is we just did a DR test this morning for one of our clients. And I guess at the end of it, I wasn't involved. What the client said to one of our engineers, well, I guess you guys are happy that worked. And I'm like, well, what did you think? We were sitting here with our fingers crossed? Like the whole week, this is why we're testing this, right? Like they were kind of like, good job, guys. I'm glad this worked. No, that's what we're here to do, right? This is what we all should be doing. This isn't done by luck, and you have to you got to run through these things. You got to find out where the kinks are. The first ones are the worst. They're going to be kinks. They're going to be things that you discover, and then staying up with it on a regular basis is part of that process. You got to be regularly testing because you will find things that somebody didn't tell somebody about, and it's going to break when you actually have a disaster. Okay, so I think I think for the most part we covered our worst and best practices. I think I don't know, Heidi, are there any other questions? Filled up the hour here fairly well.
There is one question. What's the best way to test your DRBC plan?
Well, I mean, again, Veeam has some things built into the technology, but it's, as Brandon said, it's just one part of the DRBC plan. You got to have a runbook. And a runbook is basically, think of it as a script. And that script starts with the whole process of, okay, if there has been a disaster, who's declaring it? Who has to be contacted? What's the contact methodology? Assuming that, maybe, mail for the most part works because everybody's using 065 now. But, we have customers that even do things like sending out SMS messages to people. But you got to walk through the whole runbook, test it, find out where the kinks are, fix those, do all the networking that needs to be done. Typically, we don't do active. We have some clients that do this. We have some clients that actually do complete failover, meaning that they write production data to the DR site. That's somewhat complex because if you write production data to the DR site, it means you got to resynchronize that back the other direction. And they only do this as a subset, just as test that we actually can restore the data back the other direction. But for the most part, we're doing a complete failover. We cut the link to the other site, and we basically bring everything up, and we make sure during a window that basically the primary site down, and we completely fail everything over. We just don't write production data in most cases, but that's how you test it.
Yeah, and just to add to that, so there is a Veeam product, shameless plug here, called the Veeam Availability Orchestrator. This is usually for larger environments. There's some specific requirements you have to have. But if I could describe it, the technical term we always use is sure backup on steroids. But it really is. It's not only testing your backups with sure backup or sure replica, but it is, spinning these up in a certain amount of time with predefined SLAs, all kinds of reports ready for C-level sign-off. So group things by all my SQL servers need to be up in this amount of time and everything else in this amount of time. Do all the checks. How long did that take? And lots of documentation that you can kind of add to that DR plan.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Because I mean, at the end of the day, the DR runbook is basically, if you go back. Back in the day, DRBC planning and the DR runbook 20 years ago was basically an entire set of scripts, right? It was all the things you had to do. That's gotten more and more automated. With Veeam, there's failover plans, and then there's Orchestrator. That's basically taking all that stuff and encapsulating all those scripts into rules that get executed. Orchestrator does require, I think, as you pointed out, there are some specific requirements around the VMware environment that you're running and some additional pieces that you need within VMware to get that to work. But at the end of the day, it's basically helping make that DR process, that the business continuity process, a lot more streamlined so that there aren't errors. There's less room for human error. Because if I'm reading off of a script and I'm having to go through a runbook in the more traditional sense, there is more chance for operator error because there's a human factor here. By using Orchestrator, it makes it that much more streamlined. Now, on the flip side, there's a lot more work that goes into setting that up. And that really comes into a cost-benefit analysis for your organization. Is it worth the cost of getting all the pieces necessary to get that Orchestrator to work, or can we do this by using some pieces within Veeam? Failover plans are part of Veeam, availability suite. We don't need all the VMware requirements to do that, and that plus some of the other manual processes, does that give me the same outcome? And we can help evaluate that. Good question, Heidi. I think we've hit on a lot of this for 5 minutes left, but I'll do the last kind of plug here. Obviously, we are a cloud solution provider and provide the capabilities to walk through all this, from licensing to providing disaster recovery planning, helping you find the right tools within the Veeam platform, whether it be shore backup, shore replicas. We can go through the entire gamut. And most of all, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love the opportunity to have a conversation with you, talk a bit further about what you're doing with your own organization and how we can potentially help, leveraging Veeam and our Storcom's expertise. I don't think because we did our questions kind of as we were going. Heidi, are there any other questions? But I think we're right about at the end of the time. Thank you, as always, Brandon. Appreciate you being on here with me and talking through this, and hopefully everybody found this useful today. And Heidi, you're gonna are you gonna how are people gonna be able to see the slide? Well, there's nothing much of the slide deck. If people can people listen to this again if they want to, or
Yeah, I'll be sending out a recording.
Okay. And are all the ones somebody had asked me this question the other day. I just want, so obviously Brandon and I have done quite a few of these over the last, I don't know, 5 months or so forth. If somebody wants to go back and see one of the other ones, are they available for people to look at?
Yeah, I will drop the link in the chat and people can look at it, all of our old webinars.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Heidi, for putting this on. And thanks again, Brandon. And thanks everybody for attending.
Yep. See you.
Okay. Take care.